Hey guys, I'm here with Dr. Stephen Strehle again. He's the professor here at Christopher Newport University, and he's the author of a new Virginia statute for religious freedom. He's also written several books and articles, such as The Egalitarian Spirit of Christianity, The Sacred Roots of American and British Government. It's great to have you back again today.
All right, thanks for inviting me.
If you all didn't catch the first interview, I'll put a link in the More Info section. Be sure to check that out. In this interview, we're going to be addressing your objections. Alright, so let's jump right into it. You seem to equate secularism and atheism. Why is this?
Well, there's, I think, four ways in which you can understand atheism. You can have the Madeline Murray O'Hair atheism, where you say that God doesn't exist and you're dogmatic about it. Most philosophers wouldn't accept that position. Number two, you could have the Bertrand Russell position, where you're agnostic about the existence of God. You don't know whether God exists or not. Probably not, but you're willing to say, well, there's always a possibility. And then number three, you could have the Wittgenstein type of atheism, where you think the word God doesn't mean anything. I mean, you can talk about chairs, you can talk about desks, but you can't talk about something that's not part of this world. So the word God doesn't mean anything. Being agnostic, you can't even be agnostic about the existence of God, because you don't know what the word God means. But then there's the fourth type, and that's what I'm particularly centered on when I'm talking about secularism. That's the Epicurean, Martin Heidegger type of atheism, where you think that God is irrelevant. Whether God exists or the gods exist, it's irrelevant. I can lead my life, I can study sociology and anthropology, or in the case of the United States Supreme Court, we can lead our life as a nation without God. We don't need God in our lives. The purpose of legislation, according to the Supreme Court, is secular, according to their decisions. And, for example, Lemon versus Kurtzman. Legislation must have a secular purpose.
Okay. Now, in the past video, you had said that Christianity plays a role in you finding meaning and purpose in life. Do you think atheists can also have these values?
I think they can have values, create values through a voluntaristic act, but they don't find these values in the heaven of ideas, or there's no standard of perfection in life. So, like Friedrich Nietzsche, you can say that God is dead, that we need to reevaluate values, that we need to live beyond good and evil, because morality has no specific anchor anymore. And then sort of be inconsistent with that, put that under eraser, as Jacques Derrida would say, and try to establish some sort of values. But there's clearly an inconsistency there. And maybe that's a good thing for an atheist. None of us have a complete system to put all of life together into a whole. And so maybe it's best to live with some sort of tension on this kind of issue. But it's clear that theism is the best, and in my mind, the only real foundation for believing in what is moral.
Can atheists accept or reject abortion based on their own secular or scientific reasoning?
I would say no. Scientific textbooks do not lend values. They don't provide a transcendent judgment. You can describe the maturation of a fetus in its mother's womb in copious detail in science, but in order to say that this stage is valuable and that stage is not, or even a baby is valuable, or even a full-grown human being is valuable. Here you're standing outside a scientific description and lending some sort of transcendent judgment to life.
Do you reject separation of church and state?
No, it just depends on what you mean by that. I certainly believe that the institution of the church is different from the government. I certainly believe that the church, on a personal level, has different marching orders, or even individuals have different marching orders than the state. Christians are often called to forgive other people, where the state cannot always proceed in this direction. I mean, the early church forgave the sins of the Apostle Paul, who was a murderer, whereas the state cannot proceed in that direction. But what I'm particularly against is the separation of church and state that comes from the French Enlightenment. The French Enlightenment was anti-Christian, and because it was anti-Christian, it became anti-Bible. And because it was anti-Bible, it had to reject the culture that wrote the Bible, and that is the Jews. And so you have a strong anti-Semitism that is growing up out of the Enlightenment. The French Enlightenment gave the Jews this deal. They said, okay, you can be part of our society as long as you cease being Jewish. Right? And some Jews bought that deal to become part of modern states. The Reformed Jews, at least in their most radical heyday, say, well, you don't care about the Messiah coming back. We don't care about going back to Israel. We're happy living in Germany. Deutschland über alles. Right? So I'm very much concerned about that the Jews became secular in general after that, and I think the Christian community is following in this, and I don't like state-imposed secularism.
Speaking of the Jews, you made a really controversial claim about Hitler. You had said that the Nazi regime advocates separation of church and state. Can you explain your position there?
Oh, this is not a debatable point in scholarship. I mean, Hitler used the ruse of the French Enlightenment, that is, the separation of church and state, to put the church in its place, to create an ersatz system of education. The Hitler Youth, public education was taken over by Nazi ideology in order to re-educate people out of Christian beliefs. Hitler Youth meetings met during the times of Sunday school and were mandatory during the zenith of the Third Reich. Hitler very clearly says that he wants to destroy the church after the war. He says this in his table talk. If you want to read Hitler, it's best not to look at his speeches, according to most scholars. You look at his Mein Kampf, of course. You read his second book that was written in 1928, but was not published till after the war. Albert Spears thought it was just too revealing. And then you look at his table talk, which is his very frank discussions from 1941 to 1944. There he says he wants to destroy the church.
What were Hitler's religious views?
Well, Hitler was baptized as a Catholic, but he basically became enamored with the atheistic philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, according to his own testimony and that of his acquaintances. He had a bust of Schopenhauer in his Berghof study. And basically this is a philosophy that believes that life consists of a struggle, a will to life, or a will to power, as Nietzsche would couch it, so that might makes right. Hitler rejected any concept of a transcendent deity. He believed that Rex is Lex, not Lex is Rex. That is, he believed that the king is law. So what you need is an authoritative dictator that will determine the truth. You need a powerful army that will take property, because there are no property rights. There are no inalienable rights. Might makes right.
Now, Jefferson's really famous for talking about a wall of separation between the church and state. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's two Jeffersons. There's one I really like, and that's the one who wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, who feels like all people should be able to participate in society regardless of their religious or non-religious affections. And then there's a Jefferson who, in his Danbury Baptist Association letter, spoke of a wall of separation between church and state. Now, people who believe in this wall of separation, they quote Jefferson. But Jefferson was a person who was not at the Constitutional Convention. This letter was written well afterwards, and treating it as some sort of authoritative document to interpret the First Amendment, I think, is ridiculous. And, in fact, we know Thomas Jefferson from his writings, especially his private writings, which were not meant to be published, but they ended up being published. He is an excoriating opponent of the church, which he calls the real Antichrist. He wants to perform a quiet euthanasia on the church. This is what he says in a letter to William Short, October the 31st, 1819. He has strong anti-Jewish sentiments, just like the Sons of the Enlightenment. And we see this in some of his policies, in fact, in regard to public education. He will hope to exclude the church from participation. He doesn't want clerics on school boards. He wants to take Dartmouth away from the Congregational church and give it to New Hampshire government. He wants William and Mary. In fact, he ends up receiving his wishes here, where he wants to take William and Mary away from the Anglican Church. And at the University of Virginia, in fact, he doesn't appoint a Christian professor. He has an ethics professor that ends up teaching some semblance of his religious sensibilities, but wants to wall the church off the campus.
Okay. Now, James Madison, isn't he the father of the Constitution? And doesn't he believe in church separation?
He probably does. This is open to debate because he doesn't have as many letters, and we don't have as much information on his position. But I actually think he does. He wrote the first draft of the Bill of Rights, including what we call the First Amendment. However, when you write the first draft, you don't necessarily get what you want. According to constitutional scholars, the First Amendment sounds more like a couple of delegates we have from Massachusetts and New Hampshire than it does sound like his particular position. A lot of anti-federalists complained at the time that the First Amendment did not call for the separation of church and state. In fact, what the delegates, Livermore and Ames from the North, wanted was to protect the local establishments in their districts. Townships paid taxes to support their local parishes, and of course the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law, right? Protecting the states, and particularly in this case the townships, from continuing this practice of having a local establishment.
So can the states have their own religion? Can they support a religion?
I wouldn't think so. I don't like the idea of an establishment in general. I don't think we should favor one religion, at least a priori, over another. Now, that doesn't mean that certain religions don't end up winning out and having sort of an influence on government. The Congregationalists won out in the early part of our nation, and that's why we have a democracy. They're the ones who promoted it in England first, and then in New England. It became so much a part of the American way of thinking. Or the Catholic Church and their belief in inalienable rights, which comes from the Decretalists and William Ockham in the Middle Ages, and of course you had the Salamanca school. That became an important part of our life as well. So that's in accordance with a specific religious form. They will win out in culture, but you shouldn't establish a specific religion and give them special privileges. No.
So as it stands, with the current laws and policies, do you think Christians are being repressed?
Well, not positively in general, although a recent poll, Gallup poll, says that 53% of professors at universities in America confess to hating evangelical Christians. I think many people in the audience would be more concerned if I substitute the word Jew or black, right, or someone else, because a lot of American culture tends to hate evangelicals or fundamentalists. We've even started using the word fundamentalist of Muslims, which is an interesting adulteration of a word if I've ever seen one. And so, evangelical Christians have a bizarre relationship. Many of them, of course, live separate from typical secular education because they feel like they're not represented. And that's particularly what I want for religious people in general, representation. A left-wing person would throw a fit if they read a textbook that did not talk about blacks or did not include women, right? Mainly what I'm concerned about is not positive persecution, but representation. Eventually we will have this quiet euthanasia where you don't directly attack Christianity like they did in Nazi Germany or communist Russia, but you don't represent it as anything important. Many in your audience are astounded that Puritans had such an impact on this country. Well, the reason they're astounded, because they've never read anything from Puritans. They need to read Puritans. They can look at my book if they want to get started. But the Puritans should be known more for having, important political, religious ideas, and not just bad taste in clothing or something like that.
I'll ask you about the Puritans in a minute. But what exactly is going to change if your statute becomes passed? What's going to be allowed that isn't allowed right now?
Well, we'll be able to have symbols that are religious in the public square. That would be one thing that would change. Now, I'm not necessarily in favor of posting the Ten Commandments. I'm not necessarily in favor of praying at graduation or in public schools. But the people of the state of Virginia can decide how much religion they want in the public square, or if they want a secular public square. But it's up to them. I think it's a ruse to sit around and create this ridiculous dichotomy between religion and non-religion, since religion does tend to have this omnipresent force. I mean, what do you do with the Declaration of Independence? Are you not going to post that? That has as much God talk in it as the Ten Commandments. In fact, it's worse than that. The Declaration of Independence says that the government is based upon religion, following John Locke's ideology that the government is established in order to protect the natural rights that God has given us in nature. The Supreme Court right now plays a name game. Sometimes it says the Ten Commandments can be posted, sometimes it says they can't be posted for rather capricious reasons. I'm trying to get rid of that.
So if the statute goes through, how's that going to impact other groups like atheists or Muslims?
I don't like an establishment at all. I don't like a theocracy establishing religion or clerics as those who rule the state. I don't like an atheocracy, guaranteeing that only secular people can run the state. I mean, in France, what we have in France is a culture that wants to denude itself of religious people. Look at the heroes of France in philosophy. Who do we have? We have people like Voltaire, who says, "Écrasez l'enfant," crush the filth. This is what he says in regard to Christianity. We have people like Jean-Paul Sartre, where people are condemned to be free. We have people like Jacques Derrida, who says there's nothing outside the text. Well, these sort of atheistic type of positions of the latter two certainly should be part of the great conversation. And I find Jacques Derrida to be a brilliant philosopher and has much to say, much to contribute to my own overall ideology. But we just don't want left-wing, secular, atheistic people within the public forum. Like France, we think religious people belong there as well.
Okay. Now, you also generated a bit of controversy when you mentioned the Puritans. People didn't think that they had any important role in founding America. How do you disagree with that?
I think this happens when you believe in church-state separation. Part and parcel with that belief is you think that the church has a nefarious effect upon society, and so you have to spend time discounting what they have contributed to society in general. That's one of the big problems with this French concept of church-state separation. So it's important to denigrate Puritans. It's important only to talk about negative things, hanging Quakers or witch hunts or only wearing earth tones or whatever negative thing you can pile on. Right now, the word puritanical is a pejorative term in American culture. And so I would like people to become reacquainted with religious people and have them recognize how important a part they were in founding America. They're not the only element. I mean, there's more than the church in founding America. There's more to religion than just the church in founding America. Certainly the idea of natural law goes back to Greco-Roman days. The secularism of the 18th century Enlightenment fathers was filled with lots of brilliant rationalization. You can't read the Federalist Papers without marveling at the brilliance of Alexander Hamilton in particular, and James Madison and John Jay. So I think these things come together and mix together in a great culture.
All right, now you mentioned that you were opposed to a theocracy, but what about the Puritans? Were they for theocracy?
The first usage I've ever seen of the term theocracy is by the Puritans. But what all that means is hard to say. It just means that God rules. People say as much in the Pledge of Allegiance. We live as one nation under God. I mean, in some ways, like Bob Dylan says, you have to serve somebody. It might be the Lord, it might be the devil, but you have to serve somebody, right? In the end. So I don't like using the word theocracy because it doesn't have a lot of tangible meaning. If you're thinking of an Iranian state where you have clerics running the state, The Puritans were against that, by the way. Puritans did not feel like their divines should run for public office. In that sense, they believed in a separation of church and state. I don't quite agree with that. Thomas Jefferson actually agrees with that. He doesn't feel like clerics should serve on school boards or run for public office. You know, they should be confined to the pulpit, and the pulpit should not preach political sermons. Well, I don't quite agree with that, but I certainly believe ultimately that we should have a small government, that a religion can stand for freedom. I mean, Paul in the New Testament says, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. Christianity early on was known as a religion of freedom that got rid of legalism and laws. So Paul would tell people, whatsoever you do, do it heartily on the Lord and not in man. Have faith. General commandments, but not a whole lot of specifics.
All right.
Well, I think that's my goal.
Thanks for clarifying.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right. If you guys want this video to be seen or critiqued by more people, be sure to click the like button. And as always, test everything, hold on to the good.